My name is Ibrahim Traore. I have worn the uniform of a soldier, carried the weight of command, and stood before my people in moments of uncertainty. But beyond all titles, I remain a human being, one who has seen both strength and weakness, both conviction and doubt. I was not raised to believe that man is perfect. I was raised to believe that man is capable of error and capable of returning. That no matter how far one drifts, there is always a path back, if the heart is willing to humble itself. To me, faith has never been about condemning others. It has always been about understanding the limits of our own nature. It is about recognizing that there are things greater than us, truths we do not control, boundaries we did not create. Yet, in my years of leadership, I have seen something troubling grow stronger. Not disbelief, but arrogance. There is a difference. Disbelief asks questions. Arrogance declares answers. Disbelief seeks understanding. Arrogance challenges what it does not fully comprehend. And when arrogance begins to touch what is sacred, when it crosses from doubt into mockery, from questioning into defiance, something changes. Not always immediately, not always visibly, but something shifts deep beneath the surface. I have witnessed this shift with my own eyes. I have stood close enough to see confidence turn into fear, to hear certainty dissolve into silence, to watch a man who commanded thousands become unable to command himself. This is not a story I tell lightly. It is not a story meant to accuse, to divide, or to declare one path above another. It is a story about a moment, a single moment, when a line was crossed, and about what followed, when that line could not be uncrossed. Before that night, everything seemed ordinary. There were debates, as there always are, discussions about belief, about influence, about the direction of our people. Voices grew stronger, sharper, more certain of their own position. At first it was intellectual, controlled, structured, but over time, something changed. The tone hardened, respect began to fade, and what started as argument slowly became confrontation. I remember asking myself a question that stayed with me. What happens when a man no longer fears being wrong? What happens when he no longer hesitates before challenging what others hold sacred? The story of the leader below will shed light on that. There are faces you forget with time. And there are faces that remain with you, not because of who the person was, but because of what you witnessed them become. Sheikh Ibrahim Al-Karim was one of those faces. He was 52 years old when I first came to know him closely, not as a distant figure, not as a name carried by reputation, but as a man standing in front of people, steady, composed, and certain of his place in the world. In Ouagadougou, he was not just known, he was respected. For more than 2 decades, his voice had traveled across communities, across borders, across generations. His words carried weight not because he shouted, but because he did not need to. When he spoke, people listened, not out of obligation, but out of belief. He led a network of teachings that stretched far beyond Burkina Faso, reaching into neighboring lands where his influence continued to grow. His following was not small. It was not casual. It was committed. Thousands would gather to hear him each week. Thousands more would follow him from a distance, through screens, through recordings, through the quiet spread of his message. I remember watching one of his gatherings for the first time. There was no chaos, no noise, no desperation, only attention. The kind of silence that tells you people are not just hearing words, they are receiving them. That is a rare kind of power. And Sheikh Ibrahim carried it with a calm that made it seem natural. He was not a man of many words, but the few words he chose were deliberate, measured, heavy. And that is why what happened later mattered so much. Because when a man like that speaks, it does not remain his voice alone. It becomes the voice of many. At first, my interactions with him were respectful, even thoughtful. We did not always agree, but there was a line, an unspoken boundary that both of us understood. A boundary between difference and disrespect. For a long time, that line held. But slowly, almost without notice, something began to change. It did not happen in a single moment. It happened in fragments, a shift in tone, a sharper edge in certain words, a confidence that began to harden into certainty. And certainty, when left unchecked, often grows into something else. I began to notice it during his later talks. Where once there had been explanation, there was now emphasis. Where once there had been reasoning, there was now dismissal. It was subtle at first, so subtle that many did not see it, but I did. Because I have learned that before a man crosses a visible line, he crosses many invisible ones first. And then came the day that none of us could ignore. It was not hidden. It was not whispered. It was spoken clearly, directly, and without hesitation. I was there. I remember the setting. The air felt ordinary. Nothing warned us of what was about to unfold. He stood before the camera, composed as always. No anger, no agitation. Just that same calm confidence people had come to trust. And then he spoke, not to explain, not to question, but to declare. He dismissed the faith of others not as something different, not as something he disagreed with, but as something false, something unworthy, something that should not even exist. There was a stillness after his words, not the kind of silence that comes from agreement, but the kind that comes when people realize something irreversible has just been said. I remember looking at him, searching for any sign of hesitation. There was none, only certainty. And in that certainty, there was something else. Not strength, not conviction, but pride. The kind of pride that does not ask if it is right. The kind of pride that no longer listens. In that moment, I understood something I had only sensed before. The line had been crossed. Not loudly, not violently, but completely. And what troubled me was not just what he said. It was how easily he said it. As if there would be no consequence. As if words, especially words about what others hold sacred, carry no weight beyond the moment they are spoken. But I have lived long enough to know that this is not true. Words can travel further than actions. And sometimes they return. That day, many people reacted in different ways. Some agreed. Some applauded. Some remained silent. But none of us, not one, understood that we had just witnessed the beginning of something far more serious than a statement. Because what happens after a line is crossed is never immediate. It unfolds quietly, patiently, until it reaches the moment where it can no longer be ignored. And that moment was closer than any of us imagined. There is a point where conversation stops being a search for truth and becomes a defense of identity. I have seen this happen more times than I can count. And in the months that followed, I watched it unfold again slowly, quietly, but with a certainty that could not be stopped once it had begun. It did not begin with anger. It began with concern. Across Burkina Faso and in neighboring regions like Mali and Niger, conversations about faith were becoming more frequent, not in private spaces but in public ones. Not among a few voices but among many. At first, these discussions were measured. There were questions about influence, about growth, about the presence of different religious movements within communities that had long held their own traditions. These were not new questions, but something about the timing made them more intense. Perhaps it was the speed at which information now travels. Perhaps it was the growing visibility of different beliefs sharing the same space. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a sense of uncertainty. And when people feel uncertain, they do not always seek understanding. They seek reassurance. They seek someone who speaks with clarity, with confidence, with answers that feel firm. Sheikh Ibrahim became that voice for many. At first, his words reflected what many expected from him. He spoke about preserving identity, about protecting tradition, about remaining grounded in what one believes to be true. There was no immediate alarm in that. Every community, every people has the right to hold on to what defines them. But over time, I began to notice a shift. Not in the subject, but in the tone. Where once there had been caution, there was now urgency. Where once there had been explanation, there was now warning. He began to speak more frequently about what he described as a growing influence of Christian missionary groups. He framed it not as coexistence, but as a threat. A quiet one, perhaps, but a threat nonetheless. And with each passing week, his words became more direct, more pointed, more focused on opposition rather than understanding. In a span of just a few months, his public messages increased in both frequency and intensity. Gatherings grew larger, attention grew stronger, and with attention came reinforcement. This is something I have learned as a leader. When people agree with you, they give you energy. When they applaud you, they give you confidence. But when they do both, without question, they can also give you something dangerous. They can give you the illusion that you cannot be wrong. I began to see that illusion forming. At first it was subtle, a slight dismissal of opposing views, a reduction of complex beliefs into simple labels, a tone that no longer invited dialogue, but replaced it with certainty. Then it became clearer. His messages were no longer just about strengthening his own community. They were increasingly about weakening the credibility of another. This is where the line begins to blur, because defending one's belief is not the same as attacking another's. But when those two become indistinguishable, something deeper is already shifting. I recall listening to one of his later talks during that period. There was a difference, not in volume, not in structure, but in intention. The words were sharper, the pauses were heavier, and the message was no longer simply, hold on to what you believe. It was, reject what others believe. That distinction may seem small to some, but in reality, it is the point where unity begins to fracture. And once that fracture begins, it does not remain contained. It spreads, not through force, but through influence. People repeat what they hear. They adopt the tone of those they trust. They begin to see others not as neighbors, but as opposition. And that is how division grows, not overnight, but through repetition, through reinforcement, through the steady replacement of understanding with certainty. During those months, I found myself watching more closely, not just him, but the response around him. The crowds, the reactions, the silence of those who disagreed but chose not to speak. Because silence, too, plays a role. It allows words to grow without resistance. It allows tone to harden without balance. And it allows a man to move further without realizing how far he has already gone. By the time many began to question the direction of his message, the foundation had already shifted. He was no longer just speaking to his followers. He was shaping how they saw others. And perhaps more importantly, he was shaping how he saw himself as someone certain, as someone justified, as someone beyond doubt. This is where the danger truly begins. Not in disagreement, not in debate, but in the absence of doubt. Because doubt, when honest, keeps a man grounded. It reminds him that he does not know everything, that he may be wrong, that he should listen. But when doubt disappears, so does restraint. And without restraint, there is no boundary. By the end of that period, the shift was no longer subtle. It was clear. The tone had changed. The message had hardened. And the distance between belief and confrontation had grown smaller than ever before. Looking back now, I can see it clearly. The signs were there. The progression was visible. The warnings were present. But like many things in life, we only fully understand them after the moment has passed. Because what seemed like a series of speeches was, in truth, the quiet build-up to a single act. An act that would take everything that had been said and turn it into something that could no longer be undone. There are moments in life that feel ordinary while they are happening. And only later, you understand that nothing about them was ordinary at all. That day was like that. It was the 18th of December, in the year 2023. The location was not hidden. It was not distant. It was a familiar space just behind the teaching center he led in Ouagadougou. A place where people had gathered many times before to listen, to learn, to reflect. But that day the purpose was different. I arrived without expecting anything unusual. The setup at first glance seemed simple. A phone placed carefully for recording. 2 lights positioned to remove shadows. A metal container set on the ground. And a book placed nearby, waiting. There was no crowd, no noise, no sense of urgency, only preparation. That is what made it unsettling. Because this was not an emotional outburst. This was not a moment of anger. This was something planned, something decided in advance. I remember watching him as he moved through the setup, calm, focused, certain. There was no hesitation in his actions, no sign of internal conflict, only intention. And intention, when it is steady, often reveals more than words ever could. When everything was ready, he took his place in front of the camera. The lights illuminated his face, not harshly, but clearly. He held the book in his hands, a French language Bible. He did not rush. He did not stumble. He spoke with the same tone people had come to recognize, controlled, measured, direct. He explained his purpose, not with anger, but with conviction. He said he wanted to demonstrate what he believed to be the error of another faith. He said he wanted to make his position clear, not negotiable, not open to interpretation, firm, uncompromising. As he spoke, I listened carefully, not just to his words, but to what was behind them. There was no doubt in his voice, and that absence of doubt carried weight. Because when a man reaches a point where he no longer questions himself, he also stops considering the consequences of what he is about to do. When he finished speaking, there was a pause, a brief one, but long enough for something to happen, not outside, but inside. I wondered, even for a moment, if he would stop, if he would reconsider, if something within him would interrupt what he had already decided. But nothing did. He lowered the book, placed it into the metal container, and then he lit the fire. The flame caught quickly, faster than I expected. Within seconds, the pages began to curl. The edges darkened. The structure of the book started to break down under the heat. There is something about fire. It does not argue. It does not hesitate. It simply consumes. And in that moment, it was not just paper being burned. It was something symbolic, something that carried meaning far beyond the physical object itself. I stood there, watching, not moving, not speaking, because sometimes witnessing is all you can do. The fire grew stronger. The pages turned to ash. The shape of the book disappeared. And yet, he remained still, watching, as if confirming something to himself, as if proving a point that, in his mind, had already been decided long before the flame was lit. The entire process took only minutes, but those minutes felt longer, not because of what was happening physically, but because of what it represented. When the fire began to settle, he stepped forward again, looked directly into the camera, and spoke one final sentence. He said that nothing from those he opposed could shake his faith. His voice did not rise. His expression did not change. There was no sign of fear, only certainty, complete certainty. And that is what stayed with me. Not the fire, not the act itself, but the confidence behind it. Because I have learned something in life. It is not the loudest actions that carry the greatest consequences. It is the quiet ones, done with absolute certainty, that often lead to the deepest impact. When the recording ended, there was no immediate reaction, no discussion, no reflection. Everything felt still, as if the weight of what had just happened had not yet settled, as if the moment itself was waiting for something to follow. I remember thinking to myself, this is not the end of anything. This is the beginning. Because actions like this do not exist in isolation. They do not remain contained within the moment they occur. They move, they spread, they return, and most of all, they leave an imprint, not just on those who witness them, but on the one who performs them. At the time, however, none of that was visible. There was no immediate consequence, no sudden change, no interruption, just a quiet conclusion to a deliberate act, and a man who stood there, believing that nothing would come from it. But I have lived long enough to know this. There are moments in life where silence is not peace. It is only the space before something begins. And that day, as the fire faded and the air grew still, we were standing in that space. There is something about our time that is different from any before it. A single moment, once confined to a small space, can now travel across the world in a matter of hours. What was once witnessed by a few can now be seen by thousands. And what is seen is not always understood, but it is always reacted to. The video did not remain where it was recorded. It moved quietly at first, then rapidly. Within hours, it began to reach people far beyond Ouagadougou. Screens lit up, messages spread, and what had been a private act became a public event. I remember checking the response not long after it was posted. The numbers were rising faster than expected. Tens of thousands of views, thousands of reactions, hundreds, then more, of comments. But numbers do not tell the full story. It is the nature of those reactions that reveals what is truly happening. Some people saw strength. They praised him. They called him a defender of belief. They described his action as bold, courageous, necessary. They did not question. They affirmed. And when affirmation comes quickly, it can reinforce what should perhaps be reconsidered. Others, however, saw something entirely different. Not strength, but danger. Not courage, but provocation. Their responses were not loud. They were not aggressive, but they were present. Warnings, concerns, questions, voices that did not celebrate, but hesitated. And among those voices, one message stood out to me. It came from a woman in Abidjan. Her name was Sarah Koulibaly. She was not a leader, not a public figure, not someone with influence over large numbers of people. She was simply a person watching what had happened. Her message was short. There was no anger in it, no accusation, no attempt to argue, only a quiet appeal. She said she was not against him. She did not respond with insult. She did not defend her beliefs through confrontation. She asked only one thing, that mercy would be shown to him that very night. It was a simple message, easy to overlook, easy to dismiss, and perhaps that is why it mattered. Because sometimes the quietest voices carry the deepest weight. I remember seeing his reaction to it. He read it, paused for a moment, and then he smiled, not with warmth, but with certainty. He dismissed it, not angrily, but confidently. He said that nothing would happen that night, that there was nothing to fear, that no consequence would come from what had been done. At that moment, I watched something I had seen before, but never so clearly. The separation between perception and reality. Because in his mind, the event had already ended. The act was complete. The message had been delivered, and the world had responded. What more could there be? But life does not always follow the logic we expect. There are moments where the response does not come from the outside. It comes from within. And those are the moments no audience can see, no camera can capture, no number can measure. The comments continued to grow. Debates began to form. People took sides. Arguments emerged. Some defended, some criticized, some watched in silence. And as all of this unfolded, he remained unchanged. At least on the surface, there was no sign of doubt, no sign of reconsideration, no sign that anything had shifted. But I have learned something important over time. Not all change is visible. Not all consequences are immediate. And not all responses come from the direction we expect. Sometimes, the most significant moment happens when everything appears to be calm, when the world has already reacted and moved on, because that is when a man is left alone. Alone with his thoughts, alone with his actions, alone with the question he did not ask before. And that is the moment where everything can change. That evening, as the sun disappeared and the noise of the day began to fade, there was nothing unusual in the air. No warning, no signal, no indication that anything different was about to happen. If you had looked at the situation from the outside, you would have seen only this. A man had made a statement. The world had responded. And life was continuing as normal. But I was there. And I have come to understand that normal is often the surface of something deeper. Because while the world was still reacting, the night had not yet begun. Night has a way of revealing what the day allows us to hide. In the daylight, a man can stand firm. He can speak with confidence. He can surround himself with voices that agree, with noise that strengthens him, with activity that keeps doubt at a distance. But when night comes, all of that fades. The noise disappears. The voices fall silent. And a man is left with only one presence he cannot escape, himself. That night began like any other. There was no storm, no sudden shift in the air, no visible sign that anything was different. And yet, everything was. He later told me that it began not as fear, but as discomfort, a sensation he could not explain. At first it was subtle, a warmth, not unusual, not alarming, but unfamiliar. He tried to ignore it, to dismiss it as nothing, because that is what we often do when something does not fit our understanding. We reduce it, we move past it, we refuse to give it meaning. But this did not pass. The warmth did not fade. It grew, slowly at first, then with a persistence that could no longer be ignored. It was not the warmth of the air, not the kind that comes from outside. This was different. It came from within, from his chest, from his breath, from a place he could not distance himself from. He described it as a heat that did not stay in one place. It moved. It spread. With each breath, it seemed to deepen. With each moment, it became harder to dismiss. And yet, there was nothing visible. The room was unchanged. The air was still. The world outside remained quiet. But inside, something had shifted. He lay down, hoping sleep would take it away, hoping that rest would return everything to normal. But sleep did not come easily, because the mind, when unsettled, does not rest. It searches, it replays, it questions, and sometimes it confronts. He closed his eyes, and that is when everything changed. He told me that what he experienced next did not feel like a dream, because dreams are distant, they are fragmented, They lacked the weight of reality. This did not. This felt immediate, close, unavoidable. He found himself standing in a place he could not define. There were no walls, no clear boundaries, only a presence, a space filled with something that could not be named. And then the heat returned, but not as before. This time it was overwhelming, not surrounding him, but pressing into him, as if the air itself had weight, as if every breath carried fire within it. He tried to move, but his body did not respond. He tried to call out, but no sound came. And that is when fear began. Not the kind of fear that comes from danger you can see, but the kind that comes from being unable to escape, from being present without control. The space around him began to change, or perhaps it revealed itself. Light appeared, not soft, not distant, but intense, flickering, unstable, like fire that does not consume but persists. He could see it, not as a single flame, but as many, endless, surrounding, and yet not touching. He described hearing something, not a voice, not clearly, but sound, layered, distorted, as if many things were speaking at once, but none could be understood completely. And yet, the effect was clear. It was not comfort. It was not guidance. It was pressure, the kind that forces awareness, the kind that does not allow avoidance. He struggled, not physically, but internally, trying to understand, trying to escape, trying to wake. But the more he resisted, the more defined everything became. And then he saw something that he could not deny, not in front of him, but within the scene itself. He saw the moment from earlier that day, the fire, the book, the act, but it was not distant. It was not something he was watching. It was something he was inside of. The flames were no longer separate. They were close, too close. He described feeling as if the heat he had seen before was now part of him, as if what had been external had become internal. His chest tightened. His breath became difficult, not because of air, but because of sensation. He felt something he could not ignore, not thought, not memory, but weight, a realization that did not come as words, but as feeling. Something had been crossed, not just physically, not just publicly, but internally. At that moment, everything shifted, because confidence does not survive in the presence of something it cannot explain, and certainty begins to break when faced with something it cannot control. He said that was the moment he understood something he had not allowed himself to consider before, that actions do not end when they are completed. They continue. They follow. They return. He woke suddenly, his body covered in sweat, his breath uneven, his hands unsteady. The room was still there, unchanged, silent. But the sensation had not disappeared. The heat remained, not as intense, but present, lingering, as if reminding him that what he had experienced was not easily dismissed. He sat there for a long time, not moving, not speaking, trying to understand what had just happened. Was it a dream? Was it his mind reacting? Was it something deeper? He did not have an answer, but he knew one thing. He was not the same man who had stood in front of that fire just hours before, because something had entered his awareness that he could not push away. And once something enters your awareness in that way, it does not leave easily. That night had only just begun. There is a kind of fear that comes from what you can see. And then there is a deeper kind that comes from what you cannot. What he experienced after that first moment did not end when he opened his eyes. If anything, that was only the beginning. He told me that after waking, he tried to steady himself, to slow his breathing, to return to something familiar. Because when a man feels something he cannot explain, his first instinct is to return to what he knows. He reached for prayer, not out of habit, but out of need. Because prayer, for him, had always been a place of clarity, a place of grounding, a place where uncertainty could be answered. But that night, something was different. He began the words he had spoken so many times before, words that had guided others, words that had carried meaning for years. But they did not come the same way. They felt distant, interrupted, as if something stood between him and what he was trying to reach. He paused, tried again, slower this time, more deliberate. But the same thing happened. The connection he expected was not there, and that absence was more unsettling than anything he had felt before, because it was not pain, it was not noise, it was distance, the kind of distance that cannot be measured, but is immediately understood. He told me the room felt different, not physically. Nothing had changed in what could be seen, but the atmosphere was heavy, as if the air itself had thickened, as if space had narrowed, not closing in completely, but enough to be noticed, enough to create discomfort. He turned on the light. It worked. But even then, he said something felt wrong. The light did not feel strong. It did not fill the room the way it should. It was as if brightness itself had weakened, as if clarity had been reduced. He began to look around, not searching for something specific, but trying to confirm that everything was still normal, that what he felt was only internal. But the more he looked, the less certain he became, because nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different. And then he heard it, not from outside, not from a distance, but from within. A voice, not loud, not overwhelming, but clear, the kind of clarity that does not require volume. He told me that what made it unsettling was not how it sounded, but what it did. It did not introduce itself. It did not explain. It did not guide. It reminded. It brought back what had happened earlier that day, not as memory, but as presence, as if the moment had not passed, as if it was still happening. And the voice did not accuse. It did not shout. It did something else. It questioned, not with confusion, but with certainty. It reflected his own action back to him, but in a way that stripped it of the confidence he had felt before. What had seemed strong now felt exposed. What had seemed justified now felt uncertain. And what had seemed final now felt unfinished. He tried to resist it, to ignore it, to push it away, but it did not leave, because some things, once heard, cannot be unheard. The voice did not stay constant. It did not continue endlessly, but it returned, again and again, each time bringing the same focus, the same moment, the same action, but each time with a different weight. And that is when fear became something else. Not panic, not shock, but realization. He told me that was the first time he truly felt afraid, not of something outside, but of what was happening within him, because he had always been certain of his beliefs, certain of his position, certain of his understanding, and now, for the first time, that certainty was being questioned, not by others, not by debate, but by something he could not fully explain. He sat in that room surrounded by silence, but the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with presence, not visible, not tangible, but undeniable. Time moved, slowly, each minute feeling longer than it should. Because when a man is alone with something he cannot escape, time does not behave the same way. He tried once more to pray, but the words did not come. Not because he did not know them, but because something within him had shifted. And when something shifts at that level, it affects everything. He told me he began to feel something else. Not heat, not pressure, but awareness. A growing understanding that what he had done earlier that day was not as simple as he had believed, that it carried weight, not just in the world outside, but within himself. And that realization was heavier than anything he had felt so far, because it was not imposed, it was recognized. There is a difference. What is imposed can be resisted. What is recognized must be faced. That night, he could no longer avoid what had begun, because it was no longer outside of him. It was within him. And once something reaches that place, there is no distance left to create, no space left to hide. Only one path remains, to face it, or to break under it. And as the hours passed, it became clear that he was reaching a point where one of those two outcomes would no longer be a choice. There is a limit to how long a person can resist what they know is true. Not what others say is true, not what is argued or debated, but what is felt, deeply, undeniably, within. That night moved slowly, not because time had changed, but because he had. Every minute carried weight, every moment demanded attention, and by the time the night reached its deepest point, he was no longer resisting. He was unraveling. He told me that somewhere after midnight, the struggle stopped being about understanding and became about endurance. He could not sleep, not even for a moment. His body was exhausted, but his mind refused to rest. Every time he closed his eyes, the same images returned. The fire, the act, the certainty he had felt earlier that day. But now, those same moments no longer brought confidence. They brought something else, something heavier, something he had not allowed himself to feel before. Regret, not as a thought, not as a passing idea, but as a presence, a weight that settled into him and would not lift. He tried to steady himself, to control his breathing, to focus on something else. But there was nothing else, because when a man reaches that point, everything narrows. There is no distraction, no escape, only the truth he has been avoiding. He said that around the early hours of the morning, something in him gave way. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, like something that had been held too tightly, finally releasing. He stopped trying to explain it, stopped trying to resist it, stopped trying to dismiss it. And in that moment, the realization became clear, not through words, not through instruction, but through understanding. He had crossed a line, not just publicly, not just symbolically, but personally. And that realization did not come with anger. It came with clarity, the kind of clarity that removes every excuse, every justification, every defense. He told me that was when fear changed into something else, acceptance, not of what had happened, but of what it meant. He reached for his phone. His hands were not steady. His voice, when he spoke, was no longer the same. I remember the call, not because of what was said at first, but because of how it was said. The confidence I had known in him was gone, completely. There was no authority in his tone, no control, no certainty, only honesty. And honesty, when it comes after certainty has broken, is unmistakable. He said something simple, 3 words. I was wrong. There was no explanation after it, no attempt to defend himself, no effort to soften what he meant. Just those words. And in them was everything. Because for a man who had stood before thousands, who had spoken with conviction, who had shown no hesitation, to say those words meant that something profound had changed. I did not respond immediately, not because I did not know what to say, but because I understood the weight of that moment. Some moments do not need words, they need space. He continued speaking, not as a leader, not as a teacher, but as a man trying to understand what he had just experienced. He said he could not explain it, could not define it, could not place it into anything he had known before. But he knew one thing: what had happened was real to him, more real than anything he had felt that day. He spoke about the fear, the pressure, the voice, the awareness that had grown inside him. And as he spoke, I listened, not to judge, not to analyze, but to understand, because I had seen something like this before, not in the same way, not in the same circumstances, but I had seen what happens when a man is forced to face himself without distraction. It changes him completely. He told me that by the time the night reached its final hours, he was no longer the same person who had stood in front of that fire. The certainty was gone. The pride was gone. The confidence that nothing could affect him was gone. In its place was something quieter, but far more real: awareness. And with awareness came humility. Not the kind that is spoken, not the kind that is shown to others, but the kind that is felt when a man realizes he is not beyond consequence. He said something else before the call ended, something that stayed with me. There are things that should not be touched. He did not elaborate. He did not explain, but he did not need to, because some realizations do not require explanation. They require acknowledgement. When the call ended, I sat in silence, not because I was surprised, but because I understood what had just happened. A man had reached the limit of his certainty and discovered what lay beyond it, and that discovery had broken him. Not permanently, not completely, but enough to change him forever. By the time the sun began to rise, the night had already done its work, and the man who stepped into the morning was no longer the man who had entered the night. Morning came, but it did not bring relief. Sometimes we expect the light of a new day to restore what was unsettled during the night. We believe that sleep or time or distance will return things to normal. But there are moments when morning does not erase what happened. It reveals it more clearly, more honestly. That was one of those mornings. He did not step into the day with the same presence he once carried. There was no strength in his posture, no certainty in his movement, only quiet, a silence that was not chosen, but necessary. He did not speak publicly. He did not address what had happened. He did not explain. And for a man who had spent years speaking to thousands, that silence was louder than anything he could have said. The video disappeared. No announcement, no statement, no justification. It was simply gone, but the absence of something does not remove its impact. In fact, sometimes it amplifies it, because people notice what is no longer there, and they begin to ask questions that do not always receive answers. The reactions came quickly: confusion, speculation, doubt. Those who had supported him began to wonder. Those who had criticized him began to question what had changed. And those who had remained silent began to speak, not loudly, not aggressively, but thoughtfully, because when a man who has always spoken suddenly chooses not to, it creates a space. And in that space, others begin to fill in what is missing. Some believed he had been pressured. Others believed he had reconsidered. Some thought it was strategy. Others thought it was fear. But none of them knew, because he did not tell them. And that was the most powerful part. Not the act itself, not the reaction, but the silence that followed. I saw him again not long after, and what I saw confirmed what words could not. He was different, not in appearance, not in any way that could be easily described, but in presence. The certainty that once defined him was no longer there. In its place was reflection. He spoke less, listened more, paused before answering. These are small changes, easy to overlook, but they reveal something deeper. Because when a man begins to pause, it means he is no longer certain of every step. And that is not weakness. It is awareness. He did not try to rebuild his image. He did not attempt to regain control of the narrative. He did something far more difficult. He remained silent. And silence, when chosen honestly, is not avoidance. It is processing. It is reflection. It is the space where a man confronts himself without interruption. I remember thinking that day, this is where true change begins. Not in public declarations, not in visible actions, but in the quiet decisions no one else sees. Because anyone can speak, anyone can explain, anyone can defend, but not everyone can remain silent and face what that silence reveals. The community continued to react. Discussions grew. Opinions formed. But over time, something else happened. The intensity began to fade. Not because people forgot, but because the moment had passed. And life, as it always does, moved forward. But not everything moves forward the same way. Some things stay, not in the open, but beneath, in memory, in awareness, in understanding. For him, that moment did not end when the video was removed. It did not end when the discussions faded. It did not end when the day returned to normal. Because what had changed was not external. It was internal. And internal change does not disappear with time. It settles. It reshapes. It remains. I never asked him to explain, because I understood something important. There are experiences a man cannot fully put into words, not because he refuses, but because language is not enough. All I needed to see was who he had become after, and that was enough, because in that quiet, in that absence of explanation, in that refusal to return to what he once was, there was an answer, not spoken, but clear. Some lessons are not taught through words. They are lived, and once lived, they do not need to be repeated. They remain as a reminder, as a boundary, as something that, once crossed, is never forgotten. There are moments that pass and leave no trace. And then there are moments that stay, not because we choose to remember them, but because they change how we see everything after. That night was one of those moments for me. I did not experience what he experienced. I did not feel what he felt, but I witnessed the before and the after. And sometimes that is enough to understand what truly matters. As a leader, I have seen many forms of strength. Strength in speech, strength in action, strength in standing firm when others hesitate. But that night showed me something different. It showed me the danger of strength without humility, because strength alone can push a man forward. But without humility, it can also push him beyond where he should go. I began to reflect on what I had seen, not just the act, not just the reaction, but the process, how a man moves from certainty to something he no longer controls. And I realized something that I had always known, but had never seen so clearly. Pride does not arrive loudly. It grows quietly. It feeds on agreement. It strengthens with applause. And before a man realizes it, it convinces him that he is beyond correction. That night showed me how dangerous that can be. Because when a man believes he cannot be wrong, he stops asking if he should act. He only asks if he can. And those are very different questions. I also learned something about faith. Not one faith over another. Not one belief against another. But the nature of faith itself. Faith is not a weapon. It is not something meant to be used against others. It is something meant to guide the one who holds it. The moment it becomes a tool for attack, it loses its purpose. And perhaps more importantly, it loses its balance. What I witnessed was not just a disagreement between beliefs. It was what happens when belief becomes identity, and identity becomes something that must be defended at all costs. That is where conflict begins. Not because people believe differently, but because they stop respecting that difference. And when respect disappears, everything else follows. I also understood something about limits. There are boundaries in life that are not written, not enforced by law, not visible to the eye, but they exist. And when they are crossed, the consequence is not always immediate. It is not always public, but it is real. That night reminded me that not everything we do is measured by what others see. Some things are measured by what we carry afterward, by what stays with us when everything else is quiet. And that is a measure no one else can judge, only the person who experiences it. I have asked myself many times since then, what if he had paused? What if he had questioned himself? What if he had allowed doubt to enter before acting? Would that night have been different? I believe it would have, because doubt, when it is honest, is not weakness. It is protection. It slows us down. It forces us to reconsider. It reminds us that we are not beyond error. And in doing so, it keeps us within the boundaries we might otherwise cross. That is why I no longer see doubt as something to avoid. I see it as something to value, because a man who never doubts himself is a man who may go too far. And a man who goes too far often learns in ways he did not expect. That night also changed how I see silence. Before, I saw silence as absence, as something empty. But now, I understand it differently. Silence can be full of reflection, full of realization, full of truth that has not yet found words. And sometimes, silence says more than anything we could speak. What he did afterward, that silence, that refusal to explain, that choice to step back instead of step forward, that was not weakness. That was acknowledgement, not to the world, but to himself. And that is the kind of acknowledgement that cannot be forced. It can only be reached. If there is one thing I carry from that experience, it is this. There are lines in life that we may not see clearly, lines that are not marked, not explained, not defined, but they exist. And once we cross them, we may not be able to return to who we were before. That does not mean we cannot change. It does not mean we cannot grow, but it means we will never again be unaware. And awareness is something that stays. It shapes how we speak, how we act, how we choose. That night gave him awareness, and through witnessing it, it gave me awareness as well. Not through instruction, not through teaching, but through experience and experience. is the most powerful teacher we have because it does not ask us to believe. It shows us. And once we have seen, we cannot pretend we have not. Time moves forward, whether we are ready or not. Days pass, conversations fade, attention shifts. What once felt urgent becomes distant. What once held the focus of many slowly disappears from view. That is the nature of the world. But not everything fades the same way. Some things do not stay in public memory. They stay in private understanding. And those are the things that matter most. After everything settled, after the reactions quieted, after the questions stopped being asked, what remained was not the act, not the video, not even the night itself. What remained was the change. I saw it not in what he said, but in what he no longer said. Not in what he did, but in what he chose not to do. There was no return to the same tone, no attempt to rebuild the same image, no effort to reclaim the same certainty. He did not stand again with the same confidence that nothing could affect him, because something had, and that cannot be undone. There is a truth I have come to accept. A man can appear strong in front of others. He can lead, speak, influence, and guide. But when he is alone, he must face something no position can protect him from: himself. That is the moment where everything becomes clear, not because someone tells him, but because he cannot avoid it. Sheikh Ibrahim al-Karim, once a voice that carried across thousands, reached that moment. Not in public, not in front of a crowd, but in the quiet of a night that no one else could see. And that is why I tell this story. Not to judge him, not to elevate one belief over another, not to create division, but to remind us of something simple and often forgotten. We are not beyond consequence. No matter how certain we are, no matter how many people agree with us, no matter how strong we appear, there is always a point where we must face ourselves. And when that moment comes, there is no audience, no applause, no defense, only truth. That is why humility matters, not as a word, not as an idea, but as a practice, because humility keeps us aware of our limits. It reminds us that we do not understand everything, that we are capable of error, that we should pause before we act. And respect must remain, not because we agree with everyone, but because we understand that others hold their beliefs with the same depth that we hold ours. When respect is lost, we begin to move toward something dangerous, toward actions that go beyond disagreement, toward decisions that cannot be undone. I have seen what happens when that line is crossed. I have seen how quickly certainty can turn into something else. And I have seen how deeply a single moment can affect a man. That is why I carry this with me, not as a warning to others, but as a reminder to myself to pause, to reflect, to question. Because no one is beyond making a mistake, but not everyone is willing to recognize it. And recognition is where change begins. If there is anything I hope remains from this story, it is not fear. It is awareness. Awareness that our actions matter, that our words carry weight, that what we do in a moment of certainty may follow us far beyond that moment, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is to stop before we go too far. There comes a time in every life when a man must stop looking outward and begin looking inward, not at his position, not at his influence, not at what others say about him, but at who he truly is. When everything else is stripped away, I have lived long enough to understand that leadership is not measured only by strength. It is measured by restraint. It is measured by the ability to pause when you feel certain, to question when you feel right, to step back when everything inside you tells you to move forward, because not every step forward is the right one. This story I have shared is not about one man alone. It is about all of us, because every one of us carries something within: belief, conviction, identity. And those things can guide us, or they can blind us. The difference lies in how we hold them. If we hold them with humility, they guide us. If we hold them with pride, they can lead us beyond where we should go. I have seen what happens when pride grows unchecked. I have seen how quickly certainty can become something else. And I have seen how a single night can change a man forever. But I have also seen something else. I have seen that change is possible, that even when a man goes too far, he can still recognize it. He can still step back. He can still choose a different path. And that is where hope lives. Not in perfection, but in return. Not in never making mistakes, but in having the courage to face them. The world we live in today is full of voices, many of them loud, many of them certain, many of them unwilling to listen. But I believe something simple. The future does not belong to the loudest voices. It belongs to those who are willing to listen, to reflect, to respect, to understand that we do not need to destroy what others believe, to remain strong in what we believe ourselves. Because strength that depends on tearing others down is not strength. It is insecurity, and insecurity will always lead to conflict. If we want a better world, not just for ourselves, but for those who come after us, then we must begin with something small, something personal. We must begin with humility, with the willingness to say, I may be wrong, with the courage to pause before we act, with the discipline to respect what we do not fully understand, because peace is not built through agreement. It is built through respect, and respect begins within. I speak now not as a president, not as a soldier, but as a man who has seen enough to know that no one is beyond reflection, no one is beyond change, no one is beyond the need to look inward and ask, have I gone too far? And if the answer is yes, then the most important question is not what others will think. It is what you will do next. Will you continue forward, or will you return? That choice belongs to each of us, and it is a choice that shapes not only our lives, but the world around us. I hope truly that what I have shared here does not create division, but reflection, that it does not lead to judgment, but to understanding, that it reminds us that we are all capable of error and all capable of return. For Africa, I hope for peace, for unity, for a future where strength is guided by wisdom, not pride, for a world where belief is not used to divide, but to inspire what is good. And for each of you listening, I hope you take a moment, not to look at others, but to look within, because that is where change begins. If this story has made you pause, even for a moment, then let that moment matter. Carry it with you, reflect on it, and if you feel it has meaning, share it, not to convince others, but to invite them to reflect as well. And if you choose to stay, to listen, to continue this journey of understanding, then know that you are not alone. We are all walking this path together, learning, reflecting, growing, one step at a time. And I will leave you with these words I carry not as a title, but as a truth I have come to understand. I am Ibrahim Traore, and what I have spoken comes from what I have witnessed and understood. I am Ibrahim Traore, and these words are not given lightly, but with sincerity. I am Ibrahim Traore, and this truth I share is one I carry with full responsibility. And if you have listened this far, perhaps the most important part of this story has already begun within you.